Good day. I thought today I would offer some critical thoughts about the context of current thinking about sustainability and sustainable development, and in particular the emerging idea of sustainability science. To some extent in my remarks I will be channeling some of the things that Simon Marvin was saying yesterday, and to some extent addressing issues similar to those which Eric Swingadoo raised in the previous session, but I'm sure much less eloquently than either of them. Sustainability, what is it? Well, sustainability is what we all wanted before we got smart. When the term sustainable development was first introduced in the 1980s, there were of course all sorts of jokes about it being like terms similar to military intelligence and jumbo shrimp, that it was something of an oxymoron. But in fact, what the term sustainable development allowed us to do was exactly the kind of thing that Eric was talking about today, which is to develop a sort of social construction of ignorance around a zone of constructive ambiguity whereby people with fundamentally different worldviews and interpretations could use the same term to different understandings of what they meant by it. In many ways that can be very useful because actually it stops people doing some of the activities that we have just heard about in terms of the rioting. It actually does enable people to live together, but at a cost. At a cost. Now, I would argue that the term sustainable development and our ideas of sustainability today are still dominated essentially by the Brundtland Commission's definition of 1987, which essentially is that of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. And I would argue that that has led to a 30-year discourse of damage limitation, which is in fact a very limited and impoverished idea of sustainability. And my colleague John Robinson, formerly of the University of British Columbia, now at Toronto University, has been very critical of this damage limitation definition and has argued that we should in fact be looking for something much more ambitious, what he calls regenerative sustainability, the idea of actions that actually improve the world, both for humans and for nature. Now, of course, what counts as improvement relies very much again on your worldviews and your narratives and your values. And I want to look at two narratives that are currently, I think, very popular and are being merged through efforts such as the Future Earth Initiative of ICSU and the International Social Science Council. And the first of these narratives is what I will call the Silicon Valley narrative. This is very much as Simon Marvin was presenting yesterday in ideas about the smart city. It's a narrative of employing sensing, big data, artificial intelligence in order to run the city very efficiently and effectively. The second narrative, however, is what I would also geographically, if I had to identify it, I would call it the Stockholm Resilience Centre narrative, which is that we are facing a calamitous situation in which we are exceeding the planetary boundaries, the physical limitations of maintaining sustainable life on the planet. Now, both of these narratives are questionable and indeed have been critiqued. The planetary boundaries narrative has been shown in work, for example, by Blomqvist, to be dependent on values and worldviews, not on actual physical limitations of the planetary system. And the Silicon Valley narrative, particularly the notion of the singularity that was invoked yesterday, the notion that we are moving towards a situation in which AI, artificial intelligence, will actually exceed the intelligence capacity of human beings, has been equally well critiqued by no less a person, for example, than Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, who has pointed out that the singularity, if it were ever achievable at all, is an extremely distant concept. It's extremely brittle idea. Nevertheless, there seems to be a turn to information technology, extending the smart city narrative that was so eloquently critiqued by Simon yesterday to the planetary scale. So what I'm actually suggesting at the moment is that, in fact, the notion of the smart city, which, by the way, started with the notion of the smart house. So we've gone from the smart house to the smart city, and we're now being told we've got to think about the smart planet, which is going to be governed by artificial intelligence algorithms. Because indeed, it is the curious marriage of these two visions, the Silicon Valley and the Stockholm resilience vision, into this peculiar idea that somehow our salvation, our way out of the planetary boundaries conundrum, is in fact going to be the application of Earth-orientated algorithms that understand Earth systems. And that indeed, if you start to look at some of the vocabulary that's being used by advocates of this idea, furthermore, that these algorithms should be hardwired into the thinking of decision makers. But as Paul Allen himself has pointed out, artificial intelligence is too brittle to replace human decision making. We're quite good at developing machine learning. Actually, that's a much better term than artificial intelligence. Machine learning, that we can have machines that can play Go or play chess, which are very clearly rule-defined activities. But what we can't do, and we're very far away from doing, is producing any kind of artificial intelligence that can think laterally across domains. And since we are repeatedly told that, in fact, when it comes to planetary systems, we are looking at extremely complex systems, it should be a very worrying idea that somehow or other this can be reduced to the application of these kinds of artificial intelligence algorithms. But furthermore, such a vision of artificial intelligence-driven sustainability leaves little room for democracy, and let alone any kind of social democracy. I think this has been pointed out by, amongst others, Evgeny Morozov very eloquently. So I'm going to suggest actually that it's to democracy itself, rather than to artificial intelligence and big data, that we should be looking for models of any kind of sustainability. And that it might be instructive, in fact, to return to the work of Bob Putnam from 1993 and his work on making democracy, his book Making Democracy Work. For those of you who are not familiar with this, I would try and summarize it very briefly. Essentially, what Putnam did was compare 100 provinces in Italy on various criteria of economic development and the performance of governance entities within those provinces. And he ranked them from the top performing to the worst performing. And of course, there was strong clustering, as you would imagine if you know anything about Italy, between the provinces of the north and the south, those in the north performing far better over historical time periods than the south. Putnam and his colleagues explored all sorts of the obvious variables for why this might be so, the nearer proximity of the north to the centre of Europe, for example, but that didn't seem to work out. Why on earth should that be the case when you've got the Alps in between northern Italy and the rest of Europe, and there's very little in the way of barriers around central Italy separating the north from the south, for example. Other factors were educational levels of people involved in government. It turns out there were more people with doctorates in government in the south than there were in the north. The whole question of economic expenditures by government, it turned out that in fact the national government in Italy put far greater subsidies into the south than in the north. So in other words, none of the sort of stock explanations accounted for this difference in governance performance and developmental performance of the north and the south. In the end, there was only one variable that correlated with this clustering. And by the way, it correlated so well that it correlated exactly to the rank ordering of all 100 provinces, and that was the extent to which you had voluntary organizations present in those provinces, what Putnam termed civil society. Now, the empirical findings in this book are, it seems to me, really quite compelling. But when it comes to explaining the phenomenon, why is it that the presence of voluntary organizations should make such a difference? I think Putnam comes up with a very disappointing answer. He argues that it is in fact when people interact with each other more in different contexts, they're more likely to trust each other. So you know, if you see somebody in your camera club on Thursday and you meet them at the cricket club on Saturday and so on, you get to know people better, and that there will be higher levels of interpersonal trust. All I can say to that is Putnam has clearly never spent any time in a rural English village, and he certainly hasn't spent any time with the Trotskyist and Maoist organizations I studied for my doctoral thesis. We're very close proximity, in fact, led, if anything, to backbiting, backstabbing, and witchcraft accusations of betrayal. So I didn't find that explanation convincing, but I thought what was interesting was the implication that, in fact, the difference between the South and the North was in the South you only had two forms, essentially, of political organisation, of social organisation. You had the hierarchy of the traditional landed aristocracy, and you had the competition of the mercantile capitalists. Whereas in the North, added to hierarchy and competition, you now had cooperation. And the emergence, in fact, of this whole voluntary sector from the guilds movements and from the communes of the Renaissance period. And as soon as you moved from only having two alternative forms of social organisation to having three, you have the conditions for complex development. When you've only got two, you can only switch backwards and forwards between one and another. And this would explain the stagnation of the South. While by having three, you can develop all kinds of combinations and sequences which allow for development. So this suggests that there is, in fact, something perhaps parallel to Ashby's law of minimum requisite variety, Ashby the engineer, which suggests that, in fact, for any kind of sustainable complex development, you need to have a minimum of three fundamentally different ways of organizing. And this idea has actually been taken up in the notion of intentionally clumsy systems. So rather, this is the very opposite, in fact, of the highly efficient vision of the Silicon Valley view narrative. This is the one saying that, in fact, you have to have a minimum level of cognitive and organizational diversity. It also draws attention to another challenge for us, I think, in terms of understanding sustainability, which is the whole question of long-term and short-term thinking. There's a lot of hand-wringing about short-termism in current political decision-making. And the uncomfortable insight from embracing this kind of clumsy, pluralistic notion of the conditions for sustainability that I'm talking about is that long-termism actually is a characteristic of hierarchical forms of organization, not characteristic of competitive or egalitarian forms of political organization. Hunter-gatherers never built irrigation systems, they never built pyramids, they never built cathedrals, they never built interstate highway systems. It is hierarchies that maintain archives, so that in fact we remember that the first time the smart city idea was forwarded was in Boston in the first half of the 19th century. And we are less susceptible to the continual representation of old ideas as being entirely novel. So the maintenance of archives is important. Also, the capacity to think long-term and plan long-term, such as we currently see in contemporary China, but probably not in a form that we would wish to emulate. So I think that we have to recognize that hierarchy, particularly since the 1970s, has become a very unfashionable form of social organization. It has largely been sought to be dismantled, either on the basis that we need more equality of condition, the cooperative and collectivist argument against hierarchy, or equality of opportunity, which is the narrative, of course, of the competitive way of organizing. So the question, I think, that one of the questions that we need to face if we want to actually take this idea of three forms of organization being necessary for any kind of sustainable development is how to harness the unique capacity of hierarchy for long-term thinking within the framework of democratic governance and within democratic frameworks. So rather than a new sustainability science rooted in artificial intelligence, monitoring and so forth, I'm wanting to advance the argument that we are in greater need of a new sustainability politics. And that in fact the city, rather than the state, may in fact prove to be a more promising venue for advancing that kind of agenda for a variety of reasons. I think actually I have a slightly different historical memory from the first speaker, because I remember actually climate change being an issue which emerged very strongly among cities in the United States in the 1990s, precisely as a response to the absence of national governmental action on climate change. We also know that cities are the places where citizens on a day-to-day basis encounter the kind of governance institutions rather than the national institutions of the state. It is within the city that the rubber hits the road, and therefore it seems to me that that is probably the most promising venue for the emergence of the kind of sustainability politics that I'm suggesting is appropriate here. We'll stop with that.